Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us on day two of OSCON. This is the part I've been looking forward to the most of this whole event. Following up on Robert's keynote about the virtues of open source, today we're going to dive into how these communities grow and thrive. I'm Evan Rusakis. I'm a developer advocate with Preset, and I work as a PMC member on the Apache Superset project. And I'm excited to introduce our guest today. Nadine Farah is a leading developer relations at One House. She's an Apache Hudi contributor and is passionate about bridging engineering, product, and marketing to help drive adoption of the product. She's previously led Rockset's developer initiatives, building technical content and driving developer adoption for real-time analytics. And at Bose, she worked to contribute to the watchOS SDK and worked with partners to embrace spatial audio in the music and gaming industries. LeClerc joins us as product manager at IBM. She's got over a decade experience in open source software, product, and community marketing. She was previously head of community at Ahana, the SaaS for Presto company, which was acquired by IBM. And prior to that, held community and marketing positions at Alluxio, Couchbase, Time Warner, and currently is chairperson at the Presto Federation Community Committee. She works closely with the foundation to drive open source programs. I also want to give a special shout out and thanks to Ale Murray, who's director of community at Confluent, who had planned to join us today, but unfortunately isn't able to join us this time around. Meanwhile, I'm thrilled to have these two extremely qualified people on this panel today, and I'm excited to pick your brains. If anyone here wants to add a few questions in, go ahead and add them to the Q&A tab in AirMeet, so we can keep track of those things in an orderly fashion. But for now, let's go ahead and dive in. So I want to start off with just kind of talking about community growth and how we measure that growth and how we foster that growth. How do you prefer to measure the growth and engagement and activity of your communities, and how do you kind of set and track goals around that?
So I can go ahead and get started with that. So for Apache Hudi, we use Common Room, which is a common tool I think that a lot of communities use to kind of get like a general temperature of how the community is doing, what the sentiment is, what the growth is looking like. But separately, we also keep track of community growth right in Slack, and we also have a Hudi LinkedIn, and we have a Hudi Twitter, and we also are starting to host live sessions in LinkedIn. And so we're also keeping track of how that awareness is like kind of growing as well. But separately, we personally, I keep track of like all the articles that people are mentioning Hudi in throughout the month. And we have like a sheet that we keep track of and what they're talking about. And we also keep track of like unsolicited mentions that come in and things like that. So I think that when we look at these numbers and I think we started like analyzing it this year actually. And so now we're starting to get a sense of what the growth is looking like. And then from there, we can make changes to see how do we get that exponential growth. So we're still kind of early stages. We have like maybe 6 or 7 or 8 month data, but we're making some changes to see how we can kind of grow that.
And I'll echo a lot of that. So we do many of those things. We also use Common Rule for Presto, which Presto is an open source project housed under Linux Foundation. So it's an open source SQL query engine for those who may not be familiar. And so, of course, yes, we're measuring, how many people are coming in and asking questions in the Slack channel, how many people are tweeting about us or posting about us on LinkedIn. Those are all really important kind of what I call top of the funnel sorts of activities. Yeah. We go a little bit further down the funnel, actually looking at the project itself and the adoption and the growth of the project. Obviously, GitHub is a very big part of that. So when we look at, is the community growing? We look at things like how many PRs are being raised, how many issues are being raised, how quickly are those getting answered? SLAs are actually a really important thing for us. We want to make sure when somebody new comes into our community and they have a question, whether it's getting started or a deep technical question, somebody's available to help answer. That's what we believe makes for a community that allows people to get up and running and get help quickly. That's very important. We believe in our open source kind of ethos. But looking at GitHub, how many people outside of the project main contributors are contributing back, right? So of course, Presto, if you may not know, Meta, Uber, IBM are key contributors to that, which is really great. But we want other people outside of those companies coming in. And so that's something we look really closely at, is how many folks that are not part of the core contributors are coming in and contributing to the project. And that's a really important metric that we look at month over month.
Yeah, we do the same thing too. Like in Hoodie, we host like monthly community syncs. We take a look at the PRs that are coming in, the RFCs that are coming in for proposals and features, how many PRs were merged. We also, like in the Hoodie community, we have like an internal where we talk about the community support. So what questions are coming in, which things that we need to improve in docs, or what are the more frequent questions that we should kind of take a look at and maybe pay a close attention. It actually happens in chunks that I realize within the community. And we also look at GitHub issues, like how many issues are coming in, how many are getting resolved, and what can we do to provide, better SLAs. On the Slack community, I would echo what Ali said. Like, we do our best to make sure that every question gets answered, or and if I'm not able to answer it, I pull in someone from PMC who can help triage further. So we have those sets of things in place too.
Now I'm curious, because there is, like, as you mentioned, the growth of the project in general. People adopt these projects increasingly over time, we hope, and the community grows as well. Is there a way to kind of distinguish the success of community growth relative to the success of product growth? And have you found any kind of high ROI means of fostering that growth?
Yeah, I think from a project perspective, a lot of that is taking place in GitHub, right? And so how many people are forking your repo and developing on it, and then pushing that back into the source, right? That's a big indicator for us that people are doing things with Presto, and the project is growing and projects are getting created on top of Presto. I think I mentioned earlier how many people are coming in and contributing code, right? And is it the main contributors or is it new contributors? That shows, if we see new people coming into the project and making contributions, that is a really healthy sign of growth that we like to see. So from a project perspective, that's how we're looking at it. And there's a ton of other kind of smaller metrics that I think we could probably spend a half an hour talking about, which we don't need to go into those details, but I think folks get the point. From a community perspective, I think it's what we've been talking about. At Presto, Slack is kind of our source of truth, I guess, when it comes to how many people are active and engaged with us. We try to push as many people as we can to the Presto Slack channel. That's where our engineers are hanging out. That's where our advocates are hanging out. So, questions, help getting started, these sorts of things. If we see the number in our Slack channels going up, that's also goodness for us.
Yeah, same. Slack is kind of everything. That's the number I check every day. Now, talking about project growth a little bit and kind of taking on all these new people, how does a software foundation like the ASF or the Linux Foundation play into it? How do they get involved in growth? And what are the pros and cons of working with these foundations?
Yeah. So like I mentioned, Presto is a Linux Foundation project. This is really important to us. We believe that open source projects that are part of Linux organizations like Linux Foundation or Apache Software Foundation, these are like the gold standard in my opinion, right? And for us as a Presto Foundation, it's really important that the project is neutrally governed. This means that not one company, not one person can dictate the roadmap or dictate the way a project goes. I've worked for companies that are vendor-backed open source projects, so I have experience doing both. And at the end of the day, I mean, we can just be candid here. A vendor-backed open source project at the end has to answer to a board for the most part, right? And so they're going to probably do what's best for the company, and I think that can be fine. The problem is when you see things like licensing changes, which goes on every few months. I think the big one was like HashiCorp changing its open source licensing. MongoDB did it. Redis, Elasticsearch did it back in the day, right? That can really have a negative effect on many of the developers that are using open source projects and open source products. And so at Presto, we believe that Linux Foundation gives us kind of those guiding principles to make sure that it's a neutrally governed project, that it's governed by a neutral body, and that no one person or company can really kind of take ownership of it. And so that's why we have, again, I'm just talking from Presto Foundation perspective because this is where I am, but we have about a dozen companies that are part of the foundation itself that are all working together. We meet every month. We determine the roadmap of the project. We We have working groups that are focused on different parts of the project. And so we have found that, and I have found personally, that this is an awesome way to really advance Presto in a way that makes it certain that there will never be one company or one person that comes in and dictates, something that may not be great for the whole.
Yeah, that makes sense. In that relationship with the foundation, do you ever find yourself as a project with your own processes kind of at odds with the process that a foundation might impose?
Yeah, I have felt really good with Linux Foundation. The experience I had with them is that they really let each project kind of govern itself. They obviously oversee everything, and if something were to go maybe like a little awry, they can step in and they can help and get it back on track. And I think that's really good to have a neutral body, and to have that kind of as a stopgap, if you will. If something does go like it shouldn't go, Linux Foundation can step in and say, hey, we got to get this back on track. And so I think that's been a really great thing for the Presto project.
Okay, yeah, similar. ASF provides kind of a level of oversight and just make sure you're doing all the right things and don't fall off the rails. You mentioned something interesting about vendor-backed open source projects, and I'd like to touch on that. How do you balance the support and growth of the free and open source offering of software while also promoting the commercial offering of that software? What's kind of taboo in your community and what's fair play?
I'm happy to answer, Nadine. You probably have perspective on this.
Yeah. So on this side, like for the ASL foundations, there are kind of regulations that are designed to prevent like misuse or kind of like the over commercialization of Apache products. So we should talk about that, and then that will be informative of what we can do. So for example, with the ASF Foundation, there's like a no endorsement policy. So it allows projects to be used in a way that suggests that they endorse, like you can endorse a particular product or service or company. It kind of goes back to what Ali was talking about, like a sense of neutrality, which brings us to the next thing, like the ASF Foundation has a sense of project neutrality. And it means that project websites or docs or even repos cannot favor one commercial product or service. And even if you go to like the hoodie.apache.org, you'll see like there's an image of all the players in the Apache Hoodie ecosystem, not just one. And so we make sure that we play like everything plays well into the ecosystem. And there's also like you can't like commercially advertise on the Apache Hoodie site, right? Of commercial products, that's taboo. You have to be cautious about press releases, right? And how you use the Apache name. And also kind of echoing what Ali said, like there's a sense of project independence where you're expected to operate independently of your SaaS product or something like that, and it shouldn't be driven by the company's like commercial interest. And this goes back again to what Ali said. So within that, if someone comes to me, so we have to follow those rules. But if someone comes to me in the community and they're like, "Oh, do you have a SaaS offering?" then I think it's okay to say like, this is what it is. I didn't approach it; they came to me, and I think that's okay. But otherwise, like we make sure that we focus more on the open source, and then if people come in and they're asking more questions around that, then I think it's okay to tour guide that in that way. But Ali, do you have more around that?
I agree, and I'll add that at the end of the day, if you're a vendor that has a role in an open source community, whether you've built a product that a managed service or whatnot, if you're authentic and you actually want to help people in that community be successful, I think it kind of lends itself to A, growing your own credibility, and B, to your product, right? As an example, Ahana, this was the company I was at before IBM acquired us. We had built a managed service for Presto. And so obviously we were trying to sell the managed service, but perhaps even more importantly, we really wanted to make sure the open source Presto project was a successful, vibrant, thriving, community and project. And so many of our engineers and dev advocates would spend a ton of time helping people get started with Presto. Whether or not they ended up being Ahana customers, it wasn't our objective. Our objective was to come in, to be helpful, to be known as a company that was very community friendly and open source friendly. And hey, if somebody actually, decided I actually want to use Presto and I have no idea how to run it in the cloud, why don't I like talk to you guys because you've been helping? That was awesome, right? And so we came in with the understanding that sometimes that would happen, most of the time it wouldn't, and that was okay. And it was the same thing at Couchbase when I was there. This is again a vendor-backed open source project, but we just wanted to be good to the community and be good community partners. And I think if you approach it in that way, as opposed to what Nadine was saying, like don't go in and say, hey, I got this thing to sell and I'm not going to help. I'm just going to pitch this over and over. That's not going to work, right? I mean, that's I think that's obvious, but maybe it's not. And so it's just being good open source citizens. I think if you can do that and be authentic and truly helpful, then I think that things happen as they should.
Yeah. I've seen some taboo things where like some communities like will a message about the commercial product inside the open source project. I'm sure maybe Ali, you have seen some instances of that too, and that's not good. And I think that like turns people away. So I think if you come in with like in good nature and in good faith and you just really want to help them, that's probably that mindset that you should come in with the open source community. The commercial product should be a byproduct of all those things.
Absolutely.
And speaking of the helpfulness of this community, I kind of want to take back to the individuals that are on these Slack networks. I know, Nadine, you mentioned being able to answer all of these questions that come in as a flood, which is admirable. But for either of you, I'm curious, how do you, convert a bunch of question askers into question answerers in your community? Or how do you convert a bunch of people filing bugs into people that open PRs to help address those bugs, things like that? How do you kind of activate these individuals to pitch in?
I can take a stab at that. So when you're thinking about a user journey, we can go back to a funnel. Like you have people who are just coming in and are building this awareness. That's like top of funnel, middle funnel. They know kind of what they're doing. They can be able to start a project. They can help sort of answer questions. And you have people who are deep in the funnel who are just complete experts. They're running it in production. They're the go-to person, and things like that. So in the hoodie community, I can talk specifically. We're mostly like coming in from top of funnel where people are we're building this awareness around the project. And a lot of times people are just trying to understand like what are the different services for Apache Hoodie. So Apache Hoodie is, a data lakehouse platform, helps with ingestion and management of data. And then there's an open ecosystem where there's this like query interoperability that can integrate, for example, with Presto into querying that data. But when you're coming in, it's a very complex project. There's a lot of things going on. And I think people are just trying to understand, like, how do I get started? Can I get the quick start going? And so ideally, you want to, when you're working with people who are just coming in and kind of this top of the funnel, you just kind of want to make sure they can get going right away with quick starts and the different types of environments and things like that. And I don't think in this case you should be too worried about turning them into kind of helping answer. You should be able to come in and let them ask all the questions. And then what you do with those questions, you can keep tally of those questions and the types of questions coming in, build content around those questions. And then when you get to the middle of the funnel, then you start graduating them and people start learning faster about how to get started. And then you also kind of want to graduate people from just being able to do a quick start to roping them in and helping answer the question. And I think this comes with building content around the project and different levels of complexity of the content. So what's a beginner content, what's somewhere like mid-level, and what's somewhere around expert, that people can kind of go into the weeds of the code and know how to tune it, or maybe write an extension of a function to help with emerging logic or something like that. So really advanced, right? And so in Hoodie, I mostly focus on top of funnel and somewhere mid funnel. And then PMC's members work on middle of the funnel towards expert level. And this is how we kind of parallelize our content and our contribution into the community. And within that, within people asking those questions, we answer those questions. And then usually a lot of times when people ask the same questions, those people that we answer those questions come in and help answer those questions for us. And that helps scale a little bit help scale our efforts as well. So it's just, I think part of it in my end is how do we drive content and distribution and build this type of enablement, but also rope in the community members to graduate them into being more experts. And I think we're still working that out, but this is the idea of what we're doing.
Yeah, I think it's similar to for us, right? I think Nadine, you hit all the key points. This is not an easy problem to solve. If I mean, right? One of my kind of like gold standards of if you've made it is how many people that are not within your core contributors are answering questions, right? Like if you have outside people answering other outsiders questions, that is like, wow, you've made it, right? And so turning your users into champions, Nadine laid it out. I mean, there's just so many different steps and so many different ways you need to empower them and get them up to speed and get them to a place where they're comfortable doing it. And it's an investment, and it's a totally worthwhile investment in my opinion, but it is an investment, right? And so I think Nadine laid out a bunch of different ways you can do that. And at the end of the day, it's just, you want your community to feel like an inclusive, happy place that's like where there's a lot going on. And I think creating an environment like that is the first step into getting new folks in there and getting them ramped up to a point where they're a champion of yours.
And I think there's something to be said about scalability. And when you're first like growing your community, you should not be scalable. It should be a one-on-one effort. You're trying to bring them in and you're just trying to make them successful. And those things are not scalable. And that's okay. I think when companies are, or even projects are like, well, how do I scale this? How do I scale this? Actually, scaling doesn't come until later, maybe a couple of years later, if that, because there's so much work that needs to be done to figure out what these sticky points are within a project. And all projects are different. There's no like cookie cutter way of solving this, building these top of funnel and graduating down to being help and contributing to the project. And code contribution is a really high investment, right? It takes some expertise in order to know if you made this code change, how does it affect the rest of the project? And is there backwards compatibility to what was changed? This is a high level. So it's important to, I think, to map out or build a roadmap and what this looks like. And if something doesn't work, that's okay. You just make a change and see if that's going to work too. And I think part of my strategy or the hoodie strategy is, how do we build more content and distribute that content and work with these individuals to graduate them and make them successful. And I think that's an important component.
I'll add one more thing because I think you said something really important there, Nadine, this idea of scalability. I'll say one of my biggest learnings over the last decade of working in open source and with open source companies is that if you don't have open source built into your DNA from the get-go, it makes it really hard. And by that, I mean, are the founders of the project, are the key engineers in Slack answering questions? Are they working one-on-one in these early days of open source? And I have found that if you have that built into your DNA, building a community, it's hard for the first few years, like Nadine mentioned, but if it's in there and you're doing it that way, it pays off in the end, because these are the people that know the product inside out, know the projects inside out. If they're willing to share their knowledge to help people get up and running, that's when you can start scaling, right? You start slow, and then and so I think that's, if you can get open source DNA into your company, into your project from day one, it makes a huge difference.
Thank you both for answering my questions. I've got about 1,000 more follow-up questions to those fantastic answers you've given, but I'm going to not be too greedy here and start taking a couple of questions from our audience. One of them is asking, we're often confronted with open source techs and I guess companies that provide paid services, cloud hosting, etc. How can we be sure that those technologies will remain open source and free if they're part of projects such as the Apache Foundation or Linux?
They're not part of the projects.
If they are not part, I see.
If they're not part of it.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I think, I'll kind of echo what I said earlier. Vendor-backed open source projects at the source, they're open source, right? That's part of the licensing for the most part. But these companies are making money off of what they're building around it, whether it's open core or open or services, right? And so I think it's something, if you're in the market looking for these solutions, I think it's something you have to weigh. How important is it to you that something remains open source versus if it were to go completely proprietary, would that be okay with what your needs are? And I think it's just a case by case basis, and so that's been my experience. Nadine, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel in this sense, I think it's important if a company offers open source, like, is there any governing around this open source in general? Like, what are they doing internally if it's not part of the Apache or Linux Foundation? And I think those types of questions, like what do they have in place to make sure it stays open source? Because someone can open source it, and I've seen many companies, they pull that open source out and it's not open source,
Right.
or there's some change of licensing, and there's no guarantee of what it is. It really depends on the company, how much revenue they're bringing, what they need to balance. It goes really complicated, especially if they're trying to raise a series. I would talk to product or people who are maintaining it to see what they have in place. And if there's nothing in place, then this is like a trade-off thing that you have to kind of figure out. Or maybe there's a similar tool that's part of the Apache or Linux Foundation that might be better. I think there's a lot of analysis that needs to be done on the trade-offs.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something interesting with the open core aspect of it, where it's different if you have an open source project that you're going to put a cluster around, compared to some of these offerings that will actually kind of fork a project, add a bunch of bells and whistles, and you get into this kind of fork drift problem where it gets dangerous. So you kind of need to be aware of that stuff as a customer, because the open core projects are typically more invested in the open source projects they're built around.
That's right.
Switching to another question, do you think it's too cautious to wait for a potential client to approach you before touting your commercial offering? Getting the right balance of core open source seems difficult. The evidence for which is HashiCorp's Terraform, BSLing, and potentially Fishtown's DBT license changes. I don't know about those specifics of those projects so much, but I think the question about being cautious and waiting for a client to approach you versus kind of going out and being a little more active.
I know we kind of talked about this. I'll just add one thing. If you're doing I'm assuming you're working in an open source community and you're waiting, if you want to tout the commercial offer versus waiting for somebody to ask you. I personally think it's okay if you've given something, right? If you're in there helping the community, I think it's okay to say, hey, we have an offering that might help you here, right? But you can't just come in and say that. I think you need to invest your time, invest your resources into making sure that you're known as an active community player. And so that's how I've done it in the past. And I think there have been no, issues with that.
I will echo a little bit about Ollie too. Part of it is knowing who the community member is. Like, for example, if they're like, in our case, like if Walmart is using Hoodie, we're not going to go with them to one house because we're working with them on the open source project, right? So you have to know who your communities are, where they're at in their journey, and when is a good time that it might be okay to bring it up. And there's a timing moment with that. But the first thing that you should lead in is just helping answer their questions and building that trust. And then from there, if it becomes appropriate, then I think it's okay to mention it. I usually I usually wait for someone to come to me to ask it, and I'm usually just interested in helping answer their questions. But there are strategies around when it's okay to kind of bring it up. And usually if you're hosting like open sessions that's outside of Slack channels, or people are asking about what is the difference between, OneHouse or Apache Hoodie, then it's okay to come up with those differences and understand what those differences are in terms of operational overhead or things like that. But yeah.
Right. Yeah, I agree that, a lot of times you'll see someone struggling with deploying a piece of software, and it's probably okay to just kind of say, if you'd rather not have that problem, there is a commercial offering, but otherwise here's the right channel and people to talk to.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's etiquette around this for sure.
Yeah, and it is a bit of a tightrope walk sometimes. Cool. Well, any parting words for those looking to grow their open source communities before we head off for the day?
I will just say it takes a while. Don't get frustrated. It takes, like Nadine mentioned, I think scale, right? Start one-on-one relationships, and that grows. If you are doing the right thing by your community, the community knows that. And I think our ethos has always been stay positive, stay helpful, and just be good citizens of the community. So that would be my biggest parting advice here.
I would say that too. And if someone is like kind of pressuring you early on in the project, like you just open sourced it and now you're trying to rope in contributors and users and things like that, it's okay that the on-ramp might be a little slower. and just be consistent and come up with a strategy and kind of document that strategy. And if something is not working, make 1 or 2 tweaks and then see how that changes the growth. But don't go ahead and go full blown and change the whole strategy, because then you'll never know what is working and what is not working. And it takes months to get the right data. So keeping data and analytics and understanding how performance is doing is also really key. So maybe every quarter you make an adjustment and see how that kind of changes the tune and things like that. So that's like kind of my parting advice.
Okay, well, thank you both so much. This has been fantastic. I wish I had a lot more time to ask you more questions, but thank you for everything today.
Thanks, Evan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. See you.